Back once again as we talk about the story of abortion in America, a street-level history, 1652 to 2022. Marvin Olasky, Leah Savas with us, and I might just mention that some of what we'll be talking about here relates very much to an interview we did recently with John Stemberger about the fact that he identified 50 key leaders in the pro-life movement, and at the time we mentioned that at least 36 of those individuals actually had been on Point of View. And Leah, one of those is Dr. Bernard Nathanson, who actually wrote about and had a video called Windows to the Womb, a window to the womb. And that's, of course, one of your chapters, because those of us that are a little bit older remember a time in which it might have been easy to explain and maybe mislead women into thinking, well, it's just a clump of cells. There's nothing human there. But boy, when a woman sees the ultrasound, they say, that's my baby. I can't kill that. And you have a chapter in which you talk about the significance of the implementation of these ultrasounds and how so many of them were then developed with a lot of the CareNet pregnancy centers.
Yeah, and I actually start that chapter by telling the story of Geeta Swamidass. She was the first director, or the director of the first medical pregnancy center in the country. So before this, it opened in 1985. Before that, there were other pregnancy centers that already existed, but hers was the first one that actually implemented ultrasound technology, used ultrasound technology to help women understand what was going on inside of them. And she shared some really personal stories with me about women that came to her who maybe had abortions before. One had, I think it was 11 abortions already by the time she came to Geeta and got an ultrasound on her next pregnancy. And she had never seen her unborn babies before. She still decided to get an abortion with this baby, but instantly regretted it. And when she got pregnant again, did not get an abortion finally, and married the father. And Geeta could just see how not only seeing the unborn life, but also Geeta's opportunity to tell her about what God has to say about the abortion issue really worked on this woman's heart and ultimately saved her next baby from an abortion. So, there's stories like that of just women recognizing what's going on. And as ultrasound technology becomes more available, you just hear more and more stories like that. There's one woman who works at a pregnancy center currently, and she had an abortion when she was young, but it wasn't until she was actually walking in to get an abortion that she heard from one of the pro-life sidewalk counselors that your baby has fingers and toes. And she stopped in her tracks and was like, oh, I hadn't thought about what's actually going on with, this thing growing inside of me. She still got an abortion that day, but years later today, now as she's doing her work of helping women see unborn life in their wombs, see the reality of their unborn babies, she wishes that she had that back then. She wishes that she had that visual way to understand that unborn life is human life. And that's been really powerful for the pro-life movement, especially.
Let's, if we can, also, one of your chapters, Loving Your Unborn Neighbor, because you tell the story, really, of the influence of pastors. You mentioned, of course, John Piper and Tim Keller. And, of course, we can talk about Wayne Grudem, all of individuals that have been on this program, because in some respects that was helpful as well. Individuals from the pulpit speaking to these issues, not just depending upon the lay people to lead the charge and to really raise the consciousness of the nation and of the congregation, but pastors getting involved as well.
Yeah, and John Piper's story especially was just really cool to hear. I talked to some people who were part of his congregation who talked about how it was largely his preaching on the issue of abortion, his very biblical preaching, that encouraged such a strong pro-life community at the church. So they recognized the power that their pastor had in pointing to God's word and reminding them of what God had to say on this issue. But I also loved some of the things Piper had to say about just the sin of abortion. And he made it very clear that, it's not not an unforgivable sin. It's a sin just like any other sin. And it's not like the most important thing anyone can do is become pro-life. No, the most important thing anyone can do is confess their sins to the Lord and accept Christ's sacrifice on the cross as the sacrifice for their own sins, and accept him as Lord. And I think just seeing his example of being willing to preach on this difficult issue is so encouraging, especially when in the book we also talk about all the times pastors were afraid to talk about the issue.
Yes.
They were afraid to split their church over this issue. But no, that's not helpful. You might think that's helpful because, maybe women in the congregation have had abortions. I don't want them to feel offended. But if they never hear what the Bible has to say about sin, specifically as it applies to abortion, or even what abortion is, they'll never find freedom from that past decision that they made, because freedom can only come through Christ, not from pushing it aside, not from ignoring the issue. So, it was just such an encouragement to hear pastors like him and Tim Keller preaching on this, but also interesting to hear the number of pastors who avoided the topic or seemed afraid to bring it up.
Very sad. Yeah, we have a chapter there on sensational facts, and that gets us into partial birth abortion. And even you have a quote there where they say, well, that's inaccurate. That's not what it's called. But, of course, that's really what it was. All the way down to the murder trial of the abortionist Kermit Gosnell. And so there began to be quite a bit of evidence that this is a pretty horrific practice. And in that chapter, and then in the next chapter, what you call the sanitized image, there was a real, I think, deliberate attempt on the part of the media to then sanitize what abortion is, to sort of counteract that. You talk about the number of abortion plot lines that existed in some of that. So you could really kind of get the sense that it was a battle of ideas over the issue of abortion, even over less than 20 years ago.
Yeah, and in that chapter, we talk about the Planned Parenthood staff person whose job is actually to form relationships with directors and actors in Hollywood to encourage certain depictions of abortion, depictions in.
I think yeah, go ahead.
So these are depictions that are more pleasant or favorable to the abortion industry. And so this employee at Planned Parenthood forms those relationships. She was really pleased when this one movie called Obvious Child came out. And what she was excited about with that film was that it depicted a woman choosing abortion and having no moral reservations about it.
Yeah.
It's a comedy even. So like seeing their influence on the films is really interesting, but also seeing how there are certain groups that will put out studies reviewing past films in the past year on the abortion issue, and they'll critique any film that depicts abortion in a negative light, or they'll critique lines from characters who are encouraging someone not to get an abortion. So, there's this obvious pressure from pro-abortion groups to try to get a positive image, a sanitized image of an abortion before people, just like the everyday person, to kind of change what they think about abortion. And, they've seen that work in a lot of ways with the issue of LGBTQ issues, and they think that they can do the same thing when it comes to abortion. But in order to do that, they're going to really have to avoid the second patient, like those doctors we talked about, the second patient, the second person involved in the abortion, which is the unborn child. As soon as you have the image of that murdered unborn baby, that blows that sanitized image out of the water. There's no way you can keep abortion looking nice when you have that reality.
I want to get into a couple other chapters. Aborting alone, that gets us into chemical abortion, or what oftentimes is also referred to as medical abortion. You also have a section on what's called the abortion industrial complex, in which, of course, you spend some time talking about people like James O'Keefe and, of course, Lila Rose and a variety of others that were standing in that regard. And then, of course, bringing us up to where we are today in terms of the particular decision that is come down of Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, and what that means in terms of the states and the opportunity for us to make a difference. So again, it's all part of this book, The Story of Abortion in America, and it is written by Marvin Olasky and Leah Savas, and it is published by Crossway Books. Leah, let's, if we can, talk about how things are changing. One change, obviously, is the Dobbs decision, which now moves the debate of abortion down to the states. But Chapter 45 in your book, Aborting Alone, that's the other issue, and that is it seems that almost a majority of abortions now are what we could call chemical abortions, oftentimes referred to as medical abortions, and that's why you included a chapter in the book about that.
Yes, and actually, according to the latest data that we have, a couple years ago, since the CDC data is always a little bit behind, a couple years ago even, more than half of the abortions in the country were chemical abortions. So in this chapter, we tell the story of women who have had these chemical abortions, specifically one named Leslie Wolbert. She had her chemical abortion in the early 2000s. And at the time, she didn't seem to fully understand what it was. She kind of thought it was some sort of contraceptive pill. She didn't understand that it was actively killing an unborn child inside of her. But she went through just the horrendous experience of seeing her own unborn child dead in her shower drain. At least what she thought was likely her child. But there's just this massive clot of blood that she ended up picking up and putting down the toilet because she didn't know what else to do about it. And so, there are these really graphic descriptions of what these mothers are seeing and how it's affecting them. And I'm actually hearing, this isn't in the book, but I'm hearing today from pregnancy centers that they're seeing more and more women come to them with these stories of being traumatized by chemical abortion, and just recognizing more quickly than if they had a surgical abortion where they just have that sanitized image like we talked about, where they don't actually see what's happening. Just more quickly now, if women are having these at home, often they're coming in with these traumatic stories of what they saw. And so in this book, we talk a little bit about those kind of psychological dangers, the way that aborting alone in your bathroom in your house can really affect women, even though it's seen as being really simple. Oh, you just take a couple pills and it's like a period cramp or something. But no, we see that it's really a lot more effective on these women's spiritual states. It really affects them and it really hurts them from a psychological and spiritual perspective.
Let's see if we can kind of look ahead because, of course, one of your chapters is on a new enforcement mechanism. Some of that happened obviously before the Dobbs decision. But even at the end, in the epilogue, you talk about the fact that the American abortion debate for 50 years suffered from a lack of imagination about what a world without Roe versus Wade would look like. Now, some state governments give 100% support to abortion, while others display 99% in opposition. And we're about ready to find out, aren't we?
Yeah, it'll be really interesting in the coming months to find out where different states fall on this issue. Ever since the overturn of Roe v. Wade last summer, and this is something we didn't really get to talk much about in this book because we finished writing it last summer, right after the decision came out. But since then, we've seen people reacting in very different ways to the abortion issue. Some people kind of seeming to be freaked out by the overturn of Roe v. Wade, thinking that women are going to die because they can't get abortions. We saw 6 abortion-related ballot measures in the last year in 2022, and they all resulted in pro-life losses. States like Michigan, where I live, added a right to abortion to the state constitution, and we'll likely see more and more of these ballot measures come up. So the urgency for the pro-life movement is to continue teaching, telling people about what actually goes on in an abortion. For Christians, they need to be preaching the gospel to others, telling them about what hope we have in Christ, but also what God's word has to say about unborn life and about abortion. It's definitely going to be unfolding. Basically, part 2 to this book we'll be seeing live in the coming weeks and months.
You also talk about the fact that pregnancy centers kind of expected increased violence following the decision of Dobbs, and that's exactly what has taken place. So It is a whole new world that we find ourselves in terms of the opportunity to make a difference at your local level and your statewide level, the opportunity to reach out to the abortion-minded woman and to say that there are alternatives to abortion. And then also the reality, as we just mentioned a minute ago, that some states have become abortion centers, while others have had very significant restrictions on abortion. So it is a very different kind of world. And yet I know that when you and Marvin Olasky sat down to write the 50th anniversary of Roe versus Wade, you had hoped that there would be some kind of significant change, but you had to rewrite some of those latter chapters in light of the Dobbs decision, didn't you?
Yeah, so we knew by the time we were in the final stages of writing, we knew that the Dobbs decision was headed to the Supreme Court at that point. So we were expecting something. So we kept the Chapter 50 kind of TBD. We didn't write it until last July. We were just kind of waiting, and our publishers gave us that time to, see what would happen with that ruling and then write about that and talk about how that was actually playing out in the week following the Dobbs decision. So, leading up to the Dobbs decision, I would say both Marvin and I thought that the Mississippi law behind the Dobbs case would end up being upheld, but we didn't expect that there would be a full reversal of Roe v. Wade. So that came as a real surprise and, encouragement too, but obviously there's a lot of work to be done still, and states are still sorting out how they're responding to this, with some expanding access to abortion and some enacting further protections for unborn life. So, like you mentioned, pregnancy centers are definitely in a new reality. I've talked to some recently who have mentioned seeing an increase in donations, especially in here in Michigan. A local pregnancy center I talked to mentioned how just with Michigan adding a right to abortion to the state constitution, that seems to spur a lot of people to give to them and to support them. But, in some pro-life states like Texas and Oklahoma, national pro-life groups will say that they've seen a decrease at some centers in the giving from their communities, because there seems to be this attitude among some pro-lifers, kind of everyday pro-lifers, that the fight is over, that because Roe v. Wade was overturned, that means that abortion is not an issue in our state anymore because we have a pro-life legislature. Well, no, that's not the case. Women are still accessing abortion pills online, kind of like we talked about. They're just way more accessible online than they used to be. Even in pro-life states, they can still access those pills. And women are still facing unplanned pregnancies. They still need the help of their communities. So the encouragement from those national groups is even if you're in a state like Texas, you still should be supporting your local pregnancy center and helping unborn babies who are still vulnerable, who maybe their parents weren't planning for them to be in existence. But we'll see how this continues, and hopefully pro-lifers can wake up and recognize that just as there was abortion in America long before Roe v. Wade, there will continue to be abortion in this country.
Well, Leah, thank you for writing the book, and say hello to Marvin Olasky. Thank you for joining us today. And just before we end, let me one last time mention the book is entitled The Story of Abortion in America, A Street-Level History, 1652 to 2022. 370-year debate on the issue of abortion won't change anytime soon. And it, again, is a way to educate yourself. I think if you're in the pro-life movement, if you work at a pregnancy resource center, I think this is a very important book to have. If you like this episode, follow us, tell a friend, and rate us so that we can continue bringing you the best highlights from Point of View. We'll see you next time right here on Point of View Highlights.